Welcome to episode 333 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agents Vince Pankoke and Tom Meyers. In part one of this two-part episode, they review Operation Dilido, a Group 1 Colombian Cali Cartel drug undercover investigation targeting drug lord Julio the Gun and his Miami-based lieutenant, Nando. The case relied on surveillance and wiretap coverage of multiple cell phones, hard lines, pagers, and was one of the Department of Justice's first roving T3 intercepts from microphones placed within vehicles. Vince Pankoke was one of Operation Dilido's case agents, along with retired agents Henry Mercadal and Martin Suarez. Tom Meyers was a new agent assigned to assist on the case, one of the FBI's most significant drug investigations in the 1990s. Vince Pankoke served in the FBI for 27 years. Throughout his FBI career, he worked many high-profile investigations to include drug cartels and Wall Street stock schemes. After the 9/11 attacks, he was tasked with forming a squad of agents to exploit the cell phone records of the 12 hijackers that were living and operating in South Florida. Later in his career, Vince was assigned to the undercover backstopping group and became a certified undercover agent. Vince received numerous awards for his investigative efforts, including the National Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force, OCDF Award, U.S. Attorney's Office Awards, the Colombian DAS Directors Award, and was a finalist for the FBI Directors Award. Vince is a certified FBI instructor for major case investigations, wiretaps, phone records analysis, and undercover operations. After his retirement from the FBI, Vince was referred by Dutch National Police colleagues to become the Director of Investigations for the Anne Frank cold case investigation, featured on the CBS News program 60 Minutes. At the end of part two of this case review, Vince and I talked about his work on the Anne Frank project. Tom Meyers served in the FBI for 25 years. Assigned primarily to the Miami and Baltimore divisions, he worked forensics for most of his career, usually in a leadership role on the Evidence Response Team, ERT. During his career, Tom was also a photography instructor, acquiring one of the ERT's first scanner systems, which was used at mass casualty and major events. Tom previously served as a supervisor of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS liaison and briefer to the Secretary of DHS, and counterterrorism watch commander at both the DHS National Operations Center and the FBI's Counterterrorism Watch. Since his retirement, Tom continues to work in a variety of forensic mediums, such as crime historian, cold case investigator, and consultant and film producer, but his primary goal remains to aid in solving murders, recovering and identifying victims, and developing new technologies and processes. Tom recently completed work as a creator consultant and on-screen advisor for the forensic processes used in an investigative journalism documentary, Under the Radar: Secrets of a Swedish Serial Killer, a joint U.S. and Nordic production. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to apologize again for any political promos and ads that inadvertently show up on FBI Retired Case File Review. I've sent angry messages to my ad agency demanding that they be stopped because I promised you no politics. And believe me, I definitely wouldn't intentionally be running ads for candidates I don't support. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team, where I talk about crime fiction and you can learn about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. Links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee and discover my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Vince Pankoke and Tom Meyers. Hey guys, how are you?
Doing well, Jerry. How are you?
I am excellent. Now, I know Vince from 60 Minutes, and we'll have a chance to talk about the investigation that you did trying to find out who betrayed Anne Frank and her family. If people don't know about this investigation that took place 75 years after Anne Frank was taken by the Nazis, then stay tuned for that. We'll talk a little bit about it, but in the show notes, I'll also put some links to where you can learn more. And then for Tom, I understand that you are a TV star too, that your talent and also working behind the scenes in production on a series for one of the true crime shows. And we'll talk about that also towards the end. But for now, we are going to talk about a case that took place in Miami around that same time as the Cocaine Cowboys. I mean, you guys need to have your own TV series on Netflix about this particular case. So, all right, well, who wants to start and where do you want to start?
Well, I'll jump in, Jerry. This is Vince. I was assigned to Miami in 1992 out of a 3-man RA. I began my bureau career in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And I had, promised my wife whenever I came into the FBI that I wasn't going to do 3 things. I wasn't going to work drugs. I wasn't going to join SWAT. I wasn't going to do undercover. Well, whenever I got my orders, rotational orders in Eau Claire, and opened them up, it was Miami, and had a follow-up phone call from the supervisor of D3 at that time, Ken McCabe. Welcome to the Colombian squad. So I had to break promise number 1 to my wife and ended up in Miami in 1992. And it was a dynamic time in drug investigations in South Florida. The importations had changed technique over a few years. Prior to 1990, there was a lot of airdrops coming in, a lot of boat-to-boats running right in offshore. But as law enforcement became a little bit better adept to stopping those and catching them, well, the traffickers started to revert to other methods of bringing cocaine in. And that was through containerized shipments. So all of the focus was on the ports. And we were just, at the time, on D3. I ended up coming in and being handed the case agent role of probably one of the best undercover drug cases that Miami ever did. And it was called Operation Dilido. And the 2 primary undercovers on that were Henry Mercadal and Martin Suarez, both who became my co-case agents on the case that we're going to be talking about today called Operation Dilido. It began in 1994, like many cases that you've interviewed agents about. It all started with just a random anonymous phone call into the office. And in Miami, where Spanish is second language, many times over the microphone, you would hear the operator say, complaint call for Spanish-speaking agent, complaint call for a Spanish-speaking agent. And luckily for us, it was a friend of ours, Hector Ortiz, who was on duty that day for a complaint call. And he took the call. It was a Colombian man who didn't want to give his name, didn't want to give any information about himself, but wanted to provide some details about a trafficking organization. And at that moment, a group that was at Delito Island, which is a small island and resort area in Miami Beach. And they had money laundering proceeds in the room. And that was the tip that made it down to our squad, D3. And luckily for us, we worked, as you have to when you're doing these type of cases, with the locals. We worked with the City of Miami Special Investigative Squad, the SIS squad. And we were able to make a quick phone call, dispatch agents along with Miami SIS to Delito Island. They went to the address that the caller gave us, knocked on the door, and the next thing you knew, the back security said, "Wow, a bag of money just flew out the window." And the person that was in the room tried to take off and run past the officers who were there. They were able to stop them. They were able to recover the money, which ended up being well over $100,000. It was like $114,000 in cash.
In the bag?
In the bag that was thrown out the window. And because he feared being associated with drug proceeds, when they asked the individual who ran, "Whose money is this?" He says, "No say, I don't know. I have no idea who it is." So the city of Miami, of course, was very keen to be seizing this money because during that time period, there were so many law enforcement budgets that were sort of propped up by money seizures from drugs. And so in conjunction with them, we were able to seize the money and share it with them. But when we did a search of the room, we found receipts for at least another $140,000 worth of purchases of big screen televisions. Now, we're talking 1994, so big screens back then were probably 36-inch. But they had bought nearly 100 big screens with drug proceeds, and the televisions were scheduled to be exported to Colombia. And I think during this time period, there was a big soccer tournament going on, and it was the assumption that maybe the televisions were going down to be sold during the big Copa Cup that they call it. Or the other thing that we were thinking is maybe they were stuffing the televisions with more money, more drug proceeds to be exported back to Colombia. It turned out after we x-rayed the televisions, we couldn't find any money stored in them. And we were able to seize the televisions. And the purchase of the televisions were just one way that they were attempting to launder funds, because they would send the televisions to Colombia, they would sell them there, and then they would have recouped their drug sale proceeds from the United States. And by the way, I don't know if you remember, Jerry, but during probably the 96, 97 time period, all of the division offices ended up benefiting from this seizure because these televisions were put into official use. In fact, if you took the bureau tour at headquarters after that, the televisions that were used on the bureau tour were all from this seizure.
Wow. That's a little bit of history to learn.
Oh, yeah. And the way I found out about it, I took a family member, I think in 97 or 98, to the FBI headquarters tour. And whenever I saw the televisions that were part of the tour then with different graphics and videos, I asked them, I said, "Where did they come from?" And the tour guide at that time said, "I don't know. I think they were seized out of Miami." And I got a little chuckle over that.
Well, thank you.
well, thank the narco traffickers.
Yeah, I'm sure at least one or two of those made their way to Philadelphia. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm going to bet they did. But after the seizure, the mysterious and extremely cautious informant agreed to come in and meet with us and started to provide us little snippets, little breadcrumb details about the organization that was behind all this. And let's face it, if we're only talking about $250,000 in proceeds, that's not very much. But what he was describing was an organization, one of the biggest distribution organizations out of Colombia, working in the United States. And he, again, would only give it to us in breadcrumbs. And the first thing he gave us was a license plate. He said, this is the license plate of the cell leader that's operating here in Miami and also in Houston. And it's cells that are distributing large cocaine shipment, thousands of kilos coming into the United States in containerized shipments. And, the first thing we did, we ran the license plate number, came back to a name, but it was all fictitious. And in fact, almost all of the people that we ran into in this case had the ability to obtain fictitious driver's license and registrations. And thinking back, we never really got to the bottom of how they were able to do that, whether they had fake Colombian documents that they were bringing in or what, but they were able to do it. But it was with that license plate. It all started with that and a little bit of information from the source that led us into this incredible distribution group in the case that we named Operation Dilido.
At the time, did you know who this source was or his motivation for providing you with this information?
We didn't know who he was. He gave us a name, but our research indicated it was a fake name. But it was clear from a few questions that we asked him that his motivation was monetary. But the bigger question that we had is, how do you know this information? Are you part of the organization or what? And a little bit later, we'll get to how we actually, I'm going to let Tom tell that story, how we actually figured out who this guy was, because it was an incredible coincidence and just discovery. And we figured on how he was connected to this organization. But I have to give credit to our analyst, a lady by the name of Marianne French, also a fellow Western Pennsylvania native like myself. She came onto our squad as the analyst and was actually embedded with our squad. And she was so incredibly tenacious at running all of the searches that she could with every available database that she started to be able to identify some of the people who were connected to this alias on the license plate. And right when we had all the alias and we had a chart together, the source provided us information identifying actually who the leader was in Colombia that was running this. And it was somebody that was well known. His name was Julio Correa Valdez. And he had a nickname of Julio Fierro, which is Julio the Gun. And he was well known in Medellin. He was Medellin based, but he was close to Pablo Escobar, very close to Pablo Escobar. In fact, so close to Pablo Escobar that when the DEA and the CIA were doing their best to track Pablo Escobar down, they enlisted the help of one of the paramilitary leaders down there, the guy who was head of the AUC. His name was Carlos Castaño Gil. And Castaño was head of the AUC. And also, even though Julio worked for Pablo Escobar, he and Carlos Castaño Gil, were friends. And it was Castaño that convinced Julio to cooperate with the CIA in the operation called Centra Spike. And that's where they were tracking Pablo Escobar's cell phone and sat phone whenever he was communicating with Julio. And that was one of the ways that they were able to capture him the original time. The first time they captured him was through Julio. So once we had the leader identified, and he was well named, there was plenty of institutional knowledge about Julio Correa. We started to then work towards identifying who his members were in Miami, the cell leader. And it was one of those cases that, with a little bit of help from the source and a lot of help from our analyst who was putting all this together, we were able to identify the Miami-based lieutenant of Correa as Mario Hernando Imura Jaramillo. And let's just call him Nando because that's a big old name to remember. And Nando, he was the one that was controlling the distribution cells for Correa in Miami and used it. And I'm talking thousands upon thousands of kilos of cocaine. And when we started to dig into Nando's pedigree, it became very interesting because many of your listeners may have read the book, The Man Who Made It Snow by Max Mermelstein. Mermelstein was the original, American gringo cartel pilot. And he was the one that perfected the airdrop method of cocaine. Well, he just happens to be the stepfather of Nando.
Oh, wow.
He married Nando's mother. And so Nando grew up in this cocaine distribution air cartel environment. And after Max was eventually arrested and turned state's witness, Nando went into witness protection because he was still a teenager at the time with him and his mother, but eventually came out of it. And it's almost like that old adage, if you send somebody to prison, they don't become reformed, they become a better criminal. Well, Nando, being, alone with Max this long, he almost became a better trafficker. At least in my career, and I know I'm speaking for Martin and Henry too, who have worked, they're legends in the drug case arena. I'll speak for them too. Nando was probably the most difficult drug target that Miami ever saw. And, maybe in South Florida.
Why is that?
He had this ghost-like ability to recognize surveillance. He was so incredibly conscious. When you say he had eyes in the back of his head, this guy had eyes in the back, on the sides, everywhere. He was that good.
Yeah, he was disciplined and systematically unsystematic. Everything was a dry run or check for surveillance, but it was innocuous and you never could tell when he was doing it. He didn't pull into a parking lot. He would hold up short of it and then he would do a big U-turn and look for anybody following behind him and just eye slam them and wait for a demeanor hit. That's how good he was. That's all he did.
Tom, tell him about some of the other techniques, because Tom arranged and coordinated most of the surveillance for the investigation. Some of the other little tricks that he did.
Yeah, by the way, Vince is being very humble, but talking about that team, after 9/11, those guys were selected to do all of the tracking for the wiretaps for all the hijackers, and they had it together within a day afterwards because of this case. So, I had the privilege of being signed on board with these guys. And the techniques that he would do, just like I said, he was constantly looking. You could expect if you walked behind him that he would get in your face or just walk up to you, abruptly do a U-turn. A lot of this is standard tradecraft by these guys, but he took it to a different level, constantly changing cars.
He wrote the book on SDRs, the surveillance detection routes. He had this technique where he would, even if he didn't think somebody was behind him, he just did it as a matter of practice. He would sometimes go to a mall, park, enter into one door, walk through the mall to the other side, exit, and then meet the person that he was planning on talking to who would pick him up. And from the surveillance standpoint, we didn't want to rush him. So once he parked, we gave him a minute to get into the mall. Then we would flood the mall with people on foot looking for him. And we could never find him. We didn't know where he went.
And that's because he had already left.
He was already gone. Yeah.
Yeah. He'd rent cars and then the car would be gone. He'd rent from different companies. And he was a phantom. La Fanta, right? Isn't that what we called him?
Yeah, the Phantasma. Yeah.
Phantasma. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. He was just that good. But there would be times when he wasn't as cautious, but that's because he wasn't working. He wasn't expecting a load or anything coming in. But when he was, it was nearly impossible to surveil him. He so many times caused headaches for our SOG team. And Jerry, I know you've worked with the SOG teams. So they're, some of the best at surveillance and counter surveillance. And
absolutely,
they have all kind of assets available to them. But this time in Miami, they were all equipped with American sedans with dark tint. And what did the Colombians look for surveillance? American sedans with dark tint. And when we eventually, I was getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but we eventually went up on wires on all of the US based and South Florida based members of this organization. I mean, we literally controlled the entire wire room.
Yes.
There wasn't another space for another case to bring a wire in. That's how many we had up on these guys. But we would be listening to Nando and we would be hearing what he's doing. And we could tell just from the way he's talking, is he working or is he not working? And it was so frustrating to listen and hear him calling out cars to be suspicious of. And they were always the SOG cars. So then we resorted to using only the SOG plane, and we would on the squad rent or use smaller foreign-made cars. The other thing that we found out is that if you had a female agent, which Susan Judah from U.S. Customs was our customs rep that served with it, and she helped quite a bit on surveillance. If you had a female agent, they would look right past her. They never would suspect a female agent as being part of the surveillance. I don't know why, but that's what we noticed.
Well, you should have brought in a whole SOG team of women
female
agents.
Yeah.
You were saying that Tom coordinated the surveillance. So, Tom, I've only done a few episodes where we've talked about the SOG. So could we just take a side trip and you tell us a little bit more about who makes up the SOG and, what the responsibilities are to different cases in the office?
Yeah. And I wasn't on SOG at the time, but actually later when I stepped down and went to Baltimore, I became, the relief supervisor. And then I became one of the photography instructors. Pretty rare for the agents to do it. So I have an idea, and I spent 5 years there. So I have a pretty good idea on targets. And this is the top of the heap right here. And I'm talking about hardcore Baltimore surveillances, where everybody's looking in the game there. But this is a different level of surveillance on this. So how good were they? They burned the plane. I'm going to screw up the last word, Vince. Mile, is that it? La mosca está en la mile.
Yeah.
The fly is in the honey. And we heard it on a wiretap later on. And this was also indigenous to them, is that they encoded things on the fly. So 87 would mean 78. In this case, it was pure Spanish, but it was a lot of Colombian slang Spanish. We don't speak it. I speak it just a little bit now, but we're called the monos to them, the monkeys, the white guys, and that's what they're always looking for. So we had to remove ourselves from the scene or be very distant surveillance. So it was very important for me to stay way back because they would burn us right away. And you would hear it on the wires that those guys were constantly setting up. Guys, I'm talking about Vince and Henry, who were constantly writing this. And I would do that portion of it. So we would go out and run these surveillances. And in the time period before the pipe bombs and the GPS trackers, there was a company called Teletrack out there that used triangulation. And what we would do is put a portable Teletrack aboard with us. And then we would have to radio it back and forth from the wire room as people were giving us real time, hopefully updates from the wires and tell us what was going on. And then we would run, maybe the leader or the guy who had the best continuity back to the wire would run with that Teletrack aboard on your vehicle, and you would follow any of the tracked vehicles. The problem was that there was a delay on this. So if Nando pulled over suddenly and you got a call on it, you could very well be listening and be right on his tail right away because of that delay. And then you had a hard time following him. The worst thing was to ride up on him and he's backed into a box canyon staring at you. And he would do it all the time. So as soon as he saw you, it was a good chance they were going to shut down the entire cell. And then in that case, there was no extradition. That's it. The entire cell just dissolves into the woodwork and you're back to square one. And they're just very disciplined. With the Colombians, your whole family is on the line back in Colombia. So you're not going to betray them unless you can protect your entire family. It's just, that's the way it is. So they have to be very disciplined. And if you are successful, your kids go to college. If not, well, you know what the if not is. So yes, the plane was the asset up there. Some photography. You couldn't do much with these guys because they were looking for any raised cameras. I used a spotting scope. So I'd shut the motor off because the distance was so far, and I'd use a rifle spotting scope for a distance. And that's how far away we had to be for the surveillance. So across a mall parking lot, with several other cars in between to just to stay on these guys, but forget about being within, 100 yards of them. Never was going to happen. There's too much at stake. Anything else to add to that, Vince? I know we did a ton of stuff with the surveillance of these guys.
Well, yeah, I mean, on surveillance, it wouldn't be unusual for us to have 6 or 7 cars out there just communicating with the plane and then also communicating back to the office with the teletrack operator who was sitting in front of a computer describing the movements of the targeted vehicle, whoever we were following that day. And maybe, Tom, relate how we ended up with getting some of these cars into the hands of the subjects with the teletrack, because that's a great story.
You mean the installations?
Well, the installations and the rental car company, yeah.
Yeah, so the rental car company, boy, we had somebody on the squad whose wife, I think, worked there. And I overheard a conversation and I said, wait a second, doesn't so-and-so work over there? So we were able to pick off that car, but he rotated out those cars pretty regularly. But he had a penchant for the Diamante. So we knew that's what he liked riding. He was a creature of habit too.
Nando.
Yeah, Nando. Yeah. He was also kind of his success would give him away. He was impatient and he would drive really fast. So when you saw somebody roaring by at top speed, that kind of gave him away. And, I'm getting way ahead of myself. Towards the end where we had some success on this, it was his hyper-vigilant paranoia that gave us a psych profile on him that said, but he's just going to be checking. And he did. I think it was 3 times that night without getting to the end of it. But yeah, that was him. So we were able to get a pattern of life for him, I'd say pretty quickly, but he was disciplined. No 2 ways about it. The rental car, are we talking about the install, Vince?
Yeah, well, I mean, and we did many of these installs, not the trackers that we were using. Sometimes they were magnetic. We didn't have a lot of trust in those because the battery would die quickly and or a good bump could make them come off. Plus, you couldn't conceal them and was totally hidden. So instead, our preference was to hardwire them. So go ahead, Tom.
What we would do is we'd steal his car. We would get a court order, of course. We'd go over and steal his car, bring it either to a friendly location or to a police department that was cooperative with us. And we'd have our tech guy with us who had already practiced it on another car, a similar car. We would get that car, bring it in, so they had an idea of what the wiring was like there. So this is burning up a lot of man hours doing this. We would bring that to the tech agent, and they could then turn that around pretty quickly. So success for us was maybe like a 15-minute install if we brought it all the way back to Miami. So what we would do is bring an entire team in. And I should back up for a second. The Colombians have a phrase, Vince, you told it to me first, but all cats are black at night. So they don't operate at night. They're looking for the federales out there and task forces, and they're looking for bad shapes. They're looking for tints. They want to know if they have federal heat or if a task force or if somebody's stumbling onto them that's a city detective with shirt and tie. That's how disciplined these guys. They're running it like an intelligence service. Sure, street slingers will do it in an ad hoc manner, but these guys are a different level. So back to our car, we would have a court order on it. We would get a similar looking car that would pass, for example, like a white Diamante, boxy in color. And if it was off in a distance, we would take that car with a matched key, back it out of its parking space, and we would take our similar car and pull it into it. So it would pass for the car not being stolen if somebody took a glance from as far a distance as they were parked away from the apartment building. And then we would roar with an escort as fast as we could to either back to the main office or to our offsite. And there the tech agent would install the tracker and we'd roar it back into place as quietly as possible, which would probably be nearly impossible these days with all the trackers that everything else and cameras and all that they have. But that's the way we did it back then. And the entire time I got to know every piece of Colombian salsa music because I was usually the driver of it and you couldn't touch any of the buttons. So I would hear, songs still in my head from that.
Yeah.
Level 10.
I mean, we literally threw the kitchen sink at this group and trackers. And I'm going to get to the Title IIIs, which are the wiretaps, but trash covers, you name it, even mail covers. One of the subjects happened to live in the neighborhood where our ASAC Jack Barrett lived. And he was so invested in this case, he was the drug ASAC, that we had him literally doing drive-by surveillances of the subject's house to and from work. And then when the subject fled to Colombia at one point, he was pulling the mail for us from the discarded and abandoned mail from the house. It was wild. But because we couldn't get a source directly into this group. The original source that we had, he was just so spotty. He went back to Colombia. We would hear from him once every couple months, sometimes maybe once a month, and it became very frustrating. So we had to rely on another method of penetrating them and knowing their day-to-day activities other than just pure surveillance. And that came with Title III, or as many people know it commonly, wiretap coverage.
All right, before you move on,
Yes.
I need to make sure we take the time to explain how you can step up to that level. What do you need to prove to the court for them to say, yes, you have reached that part of the investigation that I will approve a wiretap, a Title III?
Yes, for Title III, and a lot of people watch television and they think, oh, all you got to do is say, well, tap his phone. And within minutes, you're up on it. That's not the way it works at all. It is a very long process, a process of first obtaining a pen register, which is a device that records numbers coming to and from that phone that you're attempting to target. And then based on about a normal period is a month of pen register information. Once you have the numbers of who that individual, let's say Nando, is calling, and numbers that he is being called by, we're able to then run those numbers through our intelligence database and identify perhaps other traffickers, other cases that are going on in South Florida, maybe in our office or DEA or Customs, or even those out of Colombia that whenever we send the intel to Colombia, they say, oh yeah, those numbers are definitely from traffickers. And that's the first step. So we have to show that the phone is being used in the commission of criminal activity. The next thing that we have to show is that from our normal investigation, not wiretaps, if we are not going to be able to gain the evidence that we need because of how cautious this organization is and the lack of a direct source, we appeal to the judge to say the only way that we can go and obtain the evidence needed to convict them of the crimes that they are suspected is to intercept their calls. That's the only way we're going to be able to identify the width and the breadth of this organization and exactly what they are saying that will give us the evidence to convict them. And all of that information, along with what you're seeing on surveillance from the pen register and your intelligence, has to go into an affidavit to the judge. Many times, those affidavits, the judge will read it, or even before it gets to the judge, it's reviewed by an affidavit team at the Department of Justice up in Washington. They may say, listen, you just don't have enough cause to show that you need to go up on a wiretap. You need a little bit more. And generally, they will tell you what you need and you work towards that. Other times, you may never get there. But luckily for us, all of the puzzle pieces fell into place. And we were able to go up on our first wiretap. The judge approved it. And we had an incredible young prosecutor at that time, whose name is John Roth, who later went on to head various positions at the Department of Justice. And currently he is head of OIG for Homeland Security. He was just starting out and he was a go-getter. And as quick as we could bring affidavits into him, he was working on them and getting them approved. And so that's the process that we follow. But when you see wiretaps on television and people think, well, the FBI is tapping everybody's phone, back in 1994, 95, it was impossible to do anything like that and do it quickly. Unless you could show that there was imminent loss of life, something was happening like in a kidnapping, it would take weeks or months to get up on a wiretap on a phone.
Well, it sounds like it was really an important investigative tool for you because they were so keen on finding surveillance, but it doesn't sound like they considered the fact that their conversations were being overheard?
Well, I mean, Tom, wouldn't you say you touched on it a little bit on the coded conversations?
Yeah. So, like I said, first they would use a Colombian slang, which was very difficult for us to break. The common words were, for our Spanish speaking guys on the team, were okay, but they would jump off that a little bit. So we had an ethnic, Maria was from Peru, I believe. She understood the dialect well, so she could translate for us and nearly do it real time with pencils. And she would do it side by side, and that helped us immensely. She was from the National Guard, a detailee over to us. So she was able to tell us what was going on because they would encode these things and then the pigeon slang. The second part of it was they would have various informal codes just as a tradecraft measure. So like I said, they would invert the numbers, and we didn't realize that till later on. But the real clincher was towards the end of the case, we were trying to find where they were at. They would take a Spanish word and they would break the two syllables up. So in this case, what I'm talking about is camion. Camion was the word, which means trucks. And they would split it in two, and then they would invert it. So camion became mionca. Nobody knew what this word meant, but it made sense afterwards. And the moment of clarity, or the moment of brilliance, was one of the task force officers as we were tracking somebody into this giant, and I hope this doesn't become anticlimactic at this point, because I'm tracking him into this warehouse. But we heard on the wire, he said, go in off of 87 or 48. I'm probably going to mess that up in my head. If you inverted those numbers, it meant 78 or 74. And only because one of the task force officers knew that area, those were the only two blocks that made access to where we were having one of the first phone ping cases. And at the time, pinging meant just the radio direction of the third. That a slice of pie of a cell tower will break it into thirds. It still breaks it into thirds. And so you had a general idea of where that car was at or truck was at. And we didn't know it was a truck. We only knew somebody's operating in a mionca. We had an idea. And then I think it's by that inversion of the numbers, we said, wait a second, that's what they're doing. And Vince, am I getting that out of order? I knew we were looking for a truck.
Well, no, that's in order. But the important thing is that even though the Title IIIs, they proved to help us crack the case. The problem was when any of the subjects would be on their phones, they wouldn't talk at great length about the trafficking. They would just usually say, meet me here, meet me there, I'm coming over. They would not go into detail and give us evidence via the phone. What we would see is that Nando would meet with his lieutenant and then jump in the car with him, and they would drive around for an hour talking. We could see them talking. So that wasn't doing us any good because they weren't talking on the phone. They're in the car together. And our ASAC, Jack Barrett, had utilized a cellular microphone in a car when he was in New York as a young agent and said, you guys need to get an order, a roving Title III order. Well, DOJ really hadn't done many of them. And in that time period, there were none of. But John Roth, together with our team, we were able to put an affidavit together, which DOJ approved, giving us a roving Title III that anywhere that car went, we could intercept it. And anybody that would be in that car, that we could intercept it. And so when Nando would get in with his lieutenant into the car and they would be talking, well, they wouldn't be coding anything. They would be talking business right there. And that was fantastic for us. The drawback was the car that he was driving was not like a Mercedes or a Cadillac or a Lincoln. It had a lot of road noise. So if they weren't stationary, the road noise and sometimes the radio playing would drown out the conversation. Towards the end, the tech guys developed a technique in which they could filter some of that out. But it just showed you the lengths that we had to go to try to capture these conversations. But the conversations that we did capture were gold. And it allowed us to keep proceeding and going forward with the investigation. Because once you're up on a wiretap, if you're not getting something out of it, something substantial out of it, every month, the judge will not reapprove it and you'll have to drop it. And at this point, we were up on these wiretaps for probably about 5-6 months. And we knew that a shipment was imminent. A large shipment was imminent based on what they were talking about, based on their movements, how guarded they were whenever they were driving. And it unfortunately led to one of the biggest disappointments in the case that we had. I mean, everybody was so on edge. We were trying to focus on Nando, focus on just any word that would tell us when and where the shipment was coming in. And one of the Miami SIS detectives happened to, and it's not his fault, but happened to get a little too close to Nando in the parking lot of a luxury automobile dealership. Nando had already exited his vehicle. He was standing with a salesman on like the second floor balcony of this dealership looking out. And he saw the SIS detective's vehicle go by several times. And he had recognized it as following him into the dealership. And on the wires, we heard he said, I picked up a tail. I don't know where. And the wires all went dead. They dumped all of their phone.
That was a bad day.
That was a bad day.
Yeah, everybody's depressed after that.
You walked into the squad area or the wire room. I mean, it looked like, somebody's relative had passed away because we had worked so hard and we were so close. And the poor city of Miami detective, he felt so bad, so frustrated, but it wasn't his fault. It was because they were that good.
You were talking about them being so cautious of surveillance. So why did this particular detection, where Nando sees that he's being followed at this luxury car dealership, why was that particular one enough to trigger them to change phones when they were used to people following them?
I think they had a degree of productive paranoia just on a regular basis. But this was one, because there was a load that was imminently coming in. I think that he was overly cautious, and I think that he noticed that detective's car on the route that he was taking just prior to pulling in there. In fact, that day, I talked to the Miami detective. He said, I remember that day we put on 150 miles following Nando. All over, it would be sometimes Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County. And it was probably just the distance and the time that they were on him, plus the fact that there was a load imminently about to arrive, that triggered Nando's spider senses. And he confirmed, I've seen that car too much today.
Yeah, everything was disciplined, counter surveillance, always looking out. He positioned himself so he could always see. Not like a cop positions himself to the back, where his back's to a restaurant. It's just what he did.
Yeah.
I followed him in one time. So what we would do, they would use a lot of payphones. Followed him in on, well, I didn't follow him in on foot. What would happen is they would use a payphone. We would know it was a payphone. We wanted to verify that it was a payphone because we had the general idea. So I would look for payphones, and we waited till he left the area. And I walked in dutifully, but fortunately, I'm aware that I can't blend in, even though we're up in Broward County, which was more of a suburb type community. So I was able to walk in there in the middle of the day, but I still have that cop look to me. I'm aware of that. But I went to the bathroom first and then came out with quarters in hand. Like, I had to make a phone call because I never knew where these guys were. I just knew how disciplined they were. And it was because of that cautionary tale about what happened to us that I always took on a persona that I was like a half in the bag drunk, didn't know what I was doing. And I walked up to the phone to get the number and took out and I could feel somebody's over my shoulder. So I dropped some calls in, called up the phone, called my wife, started a fight with her. That's not hard to do, right? And started up with her. I'll be home when I'm home. Look, I got to meet him over here. I'm at a restaurant. Fortunately, it's a genuine conversation. And if you can start a good fight, and there's somebody on the other end that they can hear that you're all right. And so, I half drunkenly walk out, maybe, upset and everything else. And I just kind of bump into them and just move around the way. And I pass the smell test because they're both staring at me, waiting for them to look right at me. I believe it was Nando and Julio right there. I could be wrong on that, but it was two of the guys right there. And yeah.
What they after making the phone call, they came back? Because I thought you said they left.
Yeah, they left all right. But, this is what they would do. Everything was a check on these guys. And you never knew what they would counter something. So he would leave, maybe circle the place, come back. So imagine my surprise coming out. And if I had walked in there with a notebook, and I was a detective before all this, and I was full of myself and I didn't buy into this completely, and we didn't have that burn that took place, I may have walked in there with a Skillcraft notebook and a Skillcraft pen. And, I probably wouldn't have been as dumb enough to wear Oakleys and a gun bag on the front, but I walk up with a notebook and I start taking down a number. That would have been another major burn right there. But because we had that little hiccup before, we were extra cautious always. So we took on a persona of being undercover all the time. And we always had a cover story in case he rolled up on you and looked in your car. In my case, I was a window tinting guy. I had a clipboard and a backstop plan with samples on the front there, and I could take on that persona pretty quickly. I had a friend who did that, and they came right up on you and you're in your face. I never had to do that, but that was the persona I had. You had to have a reason, and I had a tape measure and a reason to be there. So I passed the smell test, but that could have been another compromise.
That was always the joke. If you have a clipboard and a hard hat, you can walk anywhere. Nobody will ever question who you are.
So were you saying that they stopped using their cell phones and went to pay phones?
Well, they would sometimes utilize both. And I don't know whether it was they weren't trusting their cell phones, because even when they did drop their cell phones, they were still utilizing their pagers. And we had a sheet hanging in the wire room where we had like 18 different pagers that we were monitoring all at once, and different codes that would come into these pagers would mean certain things to them. But even though they dropped their cell phones, it was during this time period whenever we were really learning the techniques of how to identify their new cell phone, because, they would just have a burner phone, they get rid of it and pick up a new phone. And Henry Mercadal became like the expert on that. And he worked closely with all the cell phone companies. So when Nando dropped his phone, we know that that phone is dead, but his calling circle, even to his family, his mother, his sister, his friends, that calling circle never changes because they didn't all drop their phones. And what we would look for through the cell phone companies is a newly activated phone that would be calling those common numbers. And whenever we would find that phone, and it would always, sometimes there might be two that would call them, but usually there was only one newly activated phone that was calling those common numbers. And that would be the new phone that Nando would be using. And we would go up on it.
And as we progressed in the case, these guys they seemed to become savvier, and we could chase them down pretty quickly. I became the administrative subpoena guy. In fact, I think I had a path warrant into the OC squads. The supervisors could sign off on them. And so we constantly chased down these phones and walk them through the various companies. I think there were 3 levels. So you would go to the mom and pop store, and then the service provider, A-ROM, B-ROM back in the day, and this is obsolete. And then it would bring you ultimately to the service provider, and you would provide the final subpoena to. And the caution or the concern always was that first place you would go to, because if you drop paper on them wanting to know who that was, and they got savvy, they would just buy a mom and pop store. And if the federales came in there looking for a cell phone, then they would know right away. So what we did was we would ask for all the cell phones for something so they didn't know who specifically we were looking for. So this cat and mouse game became very complex. And so, you would have 500 numbers given to you and you're only concerned with one. They didn't know which one you're looking for, but they know a Fed's in there looking, and that's enough and you hoped it wasn't going to compromise your case. But that's the stopgap measures they used to prevent that. They would also do it with mail covers. They'd buy a mom and pop store or just own the block of it. So we'd have to do and serve a whole bunch on that to try and throw a mail cover on anything. So it was perilous. Anything we did was perilous. And it had a drawback because they were very disciplined and very much in depth in their tradecraft.
And to show you how frustrating it was, when we finally did identify his new phone and the phones of the other members of the organization and went up on him, we were hearing them congratulate themselves on the load that made it in.
Wow. So during that period of time, they were actually able to bring in their shipment of drugs, and you missed it all.
And we missed it. And they have a term that they crowned the load.
Coronar.
They crowned the load. And we could hear that in the conversation, and they're patting themselves on the back. So, I mean, we know we're on a righteous organization because they're talking about a load that just came in. But the bad part is when a Colombian group like this back then would crown a load, they would go on vacation for weeks. They would just chill. They would go to Disney World. They would go to Universal. They would go back down to Colombia. They would relax and take a vacation. So the wires were a little bit dead after we heard that for a period of time. Not forever, but for a period of time.
But that time period, that lull, was really confirmation for you that you had missed a load.
Yes. And it was painful. And the next thing, and I think a lot of people, we were putting so many hours into it because when you're on a wiretap, it's not a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. We monitored the phones after we got a feel for how early they would get up and when they would go to bed. We would monitor the phones live during that time period, 7 days a week. And it was usually, from about 9 or 10 in the morning all the way through, 1 or 2 in the morning. And the amount of manpower or agent power, I should say, we were burning through was incredible. We had an occasion where our supervisor, who has passed away now, but Rick Leahy, a lot of people knew Rick in the Bureau, and he was a very good friend of former director Louis Freeh, would travel with him as part of his dignitary group. Rick was our supervisor, and he fully supported the case. I mean, he was the kind of guy that he came in admitting, listen, I don't know anything about Colombian drugs, but I'm willing to fight for whatever you need. And he did. And luckily, we had a great ASAC too, Jack Barrett, during the case where, he was fully supportive of us. But Rick saw the toll that it was taking on us. And he approached us. This was probably in the end of September, beginning of October of 1995. And remember, we had been working on this since the summer of 94. And he said, listen, guys, you're really wearing yourselves out. You all have families. Do you think it's time to pull the plug? Do you think it's time to just try to go with what you have? And yeah, we probably had enough evidence to bring a case against them. But the one thing that you always want is you want to catch them red-handed. You want to catch them with the load of drugs and the great conversations that led up to that seizure. That's best case evidence. We looked at Rick and, as much as we were all tired and we were all wanting, it to finally come to an end, we said, you know what? We've invested so much time, so much effort, all the agencies. And, that includes small agencies like Florida Highway Patrol in South Florida were helping us with pretext traffic stops and just even pulling some of the subjects over for just a speeding violation. Would let them go, but then would report back information to us. Customs, City of Miami. There wasn't an agency that we didn't work with probably in this case at one time or another. We went to the ASAC and asked Jack Barrett, we said, Rick Leahy, supervisor, thinks maybe it's time to pull the plug. And he goes, well, what do you guys want to do? I said, well, we think it's a righteous group. Miami had probably never been targeting a group this sophisticated, this large, with that many ties to Colombia. And we told him, we'd really like to keep going. And he says, well, then keep going. By all means. Is the U.S. Attorney's Office behind you? We said, yes. Yep. They're behind us. Well, then by all means, keep going. Well, the next thing that happened is within about a week, God smiled on us. Within about a week of our supervisor saying that, all of a sudden, the phones, the pagers, all the surveillance, there was a flurry of activity, which meant one thing. There's another load coming in. And this was probably 2.5, 3 months after the last load came in. So they're due. And the one thing that I will tell you that we noticed about the Colombian trafficking organizations, they take the entire time of Christmas and Three Kings. So the end of November through mid-January, they shut down. They shut down completely. And so there's usually one last big load coming in the end of September to the middle of November. So it all made sense that we saw this flurry of activity, and we were just hoping that we were going to be right. So, I mean, we did a full court press, but in the middle of all the frustrations that we had after we finally got back up on the phones and we were hearing all this flurry of activity, an incident happened that could have just blown the entire effort again.
So I think I was in the wire room when this happened, and all of a sudden the headphones are coming off and everybody's yelling and what's this? And they're convinced that there has to be some kind of compromise or something. A lot of discussions going on, a lot of loud talking. Some of it's in Spanish and everything else. And I'm trying to get my arms around what's happened over here. So it turns out that in the midst of this, they're faxing over a 10-day report, meaning, an update to the U.S. Attorney's Office on our target number and the status of it. And so that U.S. Attorney can take that target number and verify and vet it and do all that other stuff that they need to do on their end of it and move this thing along. Just a report. Well, the fax machine jams and
at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
At the U.S. Attorney's Office. So one of the recipients on the other end, a U.S. Attorney, she picks up the telephone and she wants to let us know that the fax machine's jammed, but she calls the target number on the front of it, not the sending number.
Oh, no.
You got it, Jerry. We know about that because it comes over the wire, Hi, this is so-and-so from the U.S. Attorney's Office calling and just wondering what you're sending through. And fortunately, it was a missed call and it was a non-moment. But you want to talk about pucker factor 10 and everybody
And we felt bad for the AUSA because it wasn't our AUSA. It was just one that happened to be walking past the office fax machine, saw it jam, saw a number on the cover sheet, thought that's who was sending it, and it was actually the target number that the 10-day report was referring to. So we actually intercepted an assistant U.S. attorney on the target's wire.
All right. So it went to voicemail. Is that what you're saying?
I don't remember going to voicemail. I remember him answering it.
And he hung up, yeah.
But blowing it off.
Right.
It didn't make sense to him. And no, that's the wrong number, which happens all the time on cell phones. So
that was a tense 48 hours. Like, what does this really mean? And so we had a bit of fun with that. We had a chart up, and then in jest, I threw the U.S. Attorney's Office to the side and put a big question mark and kind of broke the tension. If you know me, I've got a bit of gallows humor. My mom was a crime scene tech and I grew up in law enforcement. So, but yeah, and then, we were back on track after that. But that was a moment of,
But that phone call to our prosecutor, John Ross, saying there was an incident and we intercepted an assistant U.S. attorney on the target's phone. And he went, what? Thinking maybe, they were involved in the criminal activity. And when we explained it to him, he said, he was furious. He went to the deputy chief. They were furious. But again, it was an accident. But I think this poor AUSA, she never lived it down. I want to turn it over to Tom because Tom was doing the surveillance and he was watching what was going on in the wire room this fateful day for them. It was on October 10th of 1995.
Is this where we got onto the truck?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to add the engine incident before that? Because that was not a good day either.
Well, we can get to that maybe in one of the funny stories.
Yeah, that was a stay away from Vince on that day. But yeah, this was a good day. We were trying to figure out where this truck was. We knew that they were bringing in something substantial, so they needed to have some kind of Penske type truck. And so we flooded the area. And
they even mentioned they were going for a rental truck.
Yeah.
So we figured this was it.
So we're out hitting everything logically that we could set up, and we would try to look for any people in the cell that would be renting a truck. We knew they were going to probably use a one-off, so we also have to look for anybody that was Colombian that kind of had the look of fusion rather than moving. That was a possible. So we'd run that tag to see they were affiliated with it. At the same time, you're trying, and you're by yourself. We're at various locations, and you're trying to pick this off and send it forth. Of course, it would be low-hanging fruit to just find it. One of our guys, but one of our guys is not going to do it. One of our targets not going to do it. So I don't think we ever found that truck until we got the wire notice that it was on the move, correct?
Right.
Yeah,
correct.
We picked it up in the wire. And that's where we hear the vehicles in transit. And so this is what I alluded to before with the police officer. the energy was such that we thought a load was coming in, and it was substantial.
Well, let's back up, Tom.
Yeah.
What Henry was doing in the wire room was when he heard they were moving in the truck, we didn't have a tracker on the truck, so we don't know where it's at.
That's right. It was the ping.
And he got on the phone with the phone company for the phones of the guys that we knew went to pick up the truck. And he was asking them, he was saying, listen, I need you to give me live cell site information as they are driving, and tell me where that phone is being used. And what will happen is, as phones are moving along a roadway or anywhere, it will be on one cell tower. And then whenever it gets to the end of that range, it will jump to another cell tower. So you can literally, within reason, track somebody on their cell phone just following the cell sites. And even if it wasn't showing a good live ping, what the guys in the wire room were doing, they would call that cell phone and just like a made up number or like a telemarketer. And that cell phone would then ping on the tower. And Henry was able to say, I see the truck based on the cell sites, and it's moving south on the Palmetto Expressway, which is a major limited access road that divides Dade like east and west. So it was going south on the Palmetto Expressway. And the reason we knew that was because of the live cell site tracking.
Yeah. And Jerry, just to put this in context, a couple of things. So what we're talking about is Austin Powers type brick phones practically at this point. And so you're talking about the very earliest generation of cell towers that were out there. There's not that many of them back then. And I believe they were omnidirectional. I said before that they were tri-directional, but I think they were coming out of the multi-directional. You just could not tell, and it would just register to those phones. So we were able to pick that up. And if memory serves, we couldn't do this off the teletrack. We were doing it off of paper maps up on the wall as Henry's calling this, monitoring the wire, looking at maybe the teletrack. And that's how we would track ourselves a lot. We would bring that portable teletrack unit so it could verify where we were at rather than us just calling the address. And you could get genuine data and see where the team was operating at.
Before you actually found some of the lower tiered subjects riding around in this truck, were you saying that you had people located at all of the rental truck facilities trying to find one of them renting a truck?
On the wire, they gave a hint. They kind of described where they were going. I think they said Miramar or Mar, which is an area in southern Broward on the Dade border. So with surveillance out there, and we weren't tracking them at that time, we sent cars to the logical large rental places because, there's a lot of them nowadays, but back then there weren't that many. And we knew of a few that they had used in the past. But unfortunately, as Tom indicated, we weren't lucky enough. Nobody spotted them at the rental car place. We're only able to locate the truck once Henry started to ping their phone to find out where they were when they indicated that they were driving.
Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't get that one because I know we were on the Golden Glades and I'd sat there for a good long time. 6 hours is what I had in the notes.
Yeah.
And they must have just, I'm surprised, but I got through.
It's incredible, Jerry, because Tom he was a new agent at this time, kept all of his notes, his surveillance notes, and just his case notes from that time. And we've been referring back to them.
Yeah, just a little bit, that time period. And I do remember eating a baker's dozen of Einstein's chocolate chip bagels that's sitting there. But I figured they were onto the truck. And then that's when as I said before, the one task force officer, he recognized he had patrolled that area because it's a warehouse district. And he was able to goes, no, this is what it is. So we flooded that area, and another guy picked up a Penske truck. I couldn't believe it because I was in the area too. And we're searching everything, hoping not to get burned. And this guy picks it up and he says, I got the truck and it's backed up to a warehouse. And that was it. We crowned the load at that point. Yeah.
Well, that was in the afternoon, and that started an all-night surveillance on that warehouse because what the surveillance could see was that we know they went to just pick the truck up, but what did they have in the truck? We weren't really sure.
Yeah, you weren't sure if they had actually gotten the shipment inside the truck, or you have an empty truck and they're going to go get the shipment.
Yeah. And even to this day, as Vince is explaining portions of it, you didn't know what was happening because we didn't have a common communication medium. You had maybe the bureau radio and you would get a piece of the story there, and kind of makes sense when they explain it afterwards. But we're moving so fast that it's hard to keep up.
And that's the end of this 2-part case review. Part 2 will be posted next week. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of Vince Pankoke and Tom Meyers, links to articles about Operation Dilido, and lots of case-related images. There are also links to more FBI retired case file review episodes about Miami drug cartel investigations. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.